I guess this is just another lost cause, Mr. Payne. All you people don't know about lost causes. Mr. Payne does. He said once they were the only causes worth fighting for. And he fought for them once. For the only reason any man ever fights for them. Because of just one plain, simple rule. Love thy neighbor. And in this world today full of hatred, a man who knows that one rule has a great trust. You know that rule, Mr. Payne. And I loved you for it just as my father did. And you know that you fight for the lost causes harder than for any others. Yes, you even die for them. Like a man we both knew, Mr. Payne. You think I'm licked? You all think I'm licked. Well, I'm not licked. And I'm gonna stay right here and fight for this lost cause. Even if this room gets filled with lies like these. And the tailors and all their armies come marching into this place. Somebody will listen to me.
I welcome this kind of examination.
You are free to do as we tell you. You are free to do as we tell you.
His head could be seen to move violently forward.
Back and to the left. Back and to the left.
That's why I don't read the newspaper. I'm a man. I'm 40.
What did the president know, and when did he know it?
I began by telling the president that there was a cancer growing on the presidency.
As of now, I am in control here in the White House.
This is crack cocaine from the White House. It could easily have been heroin or PCP. It's as innocent looking as candy.
Good evening. This is Mae Brussel in Carmel, California.
Anybody who's not willing to change based on what they learned is ignorant.
Coffee's for closers only.
I think we're giving you enough.
On to Chicago and let's win there.
Keep hope alive. Keep hope alive. Keep hope alive.
This is the Midnight Rider News Show with S.T. Patrick.
Hi, this is Thurston Clark. You're listening to the Midnight Riders News Show with S.T. Patrick.
Hello, America and the world. Welcome to the Midnight Rider News Show. I'm S.T. Patrick, your friendly neighborhood host, traipsing and traversing through the trials and travails that have so tempestuously and untruthfully been blasted into your eyes, ears, and minds by the state-sponsored talking heads, the court historians, and the textbook conglomerates that control information today. Tonight, we have episode 117, Joseph McBride on Unmasking Frank Capra. Our guest tonight is film historian, author, and Kennedy assassination researcher, Joseph McBride. He'll join us next in the midnight hour. First, let us clean this castle. So you can still order the PDF e-version of Garrison, the Journal of History and Deep Politics. You know, this is our first issue, and the feedback has been great. You've all been so kind. Thank you very much for that. Now, it's still $8.99 anywhere in the world, so there's no conversion there. There's no extra fee for being international. There's none of that. It's just $8.99. So we think that that's a value for 116 pages of content that you do receive. So it is quite a large magazine. So we do think that that's worth it. And all proceeds go to doing issue 2. I have not made a dime on this, and I can promise you that I won't. So you can go to midnightridernews.com to order the first issue. And no, you do not have to have an e-reader to read a PDF file. I was asked that this week. The answer is no, you do not. You can read it on a phone. You can read it on a desktop computer. You can read it on a laptop computer. No problems there. So thank you to everyone who has already ordered. Thank you so much. But if you haven't, now is the time. We'll be right back with Joseph McBride.
This is Dave Ratcliffe, architect and publisher of Radical.org. Why were early Warren Commission critics Vincent Salandria, Mae Brussel, and John Judge so valuable? For that answer, more on my relationship with Fletcher Prouty and how nuclear power ties into it all, listen to episode 101 of the Midnight Rider News Show.
An occasion like this, when we all get together to pay homage to our craft, it forces me to think, how in the hell did I get up here? Well, Nearly 79 years ago, I celebrated my 6th birthday in the black, dark hole of a creaking ship crammed with retching, praying, terrorized immigrants. 13 days of misery. And then the ship stopped. And my father grabbed me and carried me up the steep iron stairs to the deck. And then he shouted, "Chico, look at that." At first, all I saw was a deck full of people on their knees, crying and rejoicing. My father cried, "That's the greatest light since the Star of Bethlehem." I looked up, and there was the statue of a great lady, taller than a church steeple, holding a lamp over the land we were about to enter. And my father said, "It's the light of freedom, Chico. Remember that. Freedom." So, finally, there is something I must say to some other members of my family, and I believe that they will hear me. Mama, Papa, Big Brother Ben, Josephine, Tony, little sister Ann, remember the day we arrived at the Southern Pacific Station here in Los Angeles, and Papa and Mama kissed the ground? Look, the American Film Institute has given me its Life Achievement Award. And for that, I am thanking them and all my friends who have come here. But for America, just for living here, I kiss the ground. Thank you very much.
That was director Frank Capra receiving the Lifetime Achievement Award from the AFI, the American Film Institute. And Joseph McBride is a film historian and author, a Kennedy assassination researcher, now an actor, more on that later, and a hail fellow well met. His first book on Frank Capra, the 1992 biography, Frank Capra, The Catastrophe of Success, was not an easy work to get published. It was so difficult, in fact, that the story of that long journey to publication is the topic of Joseph McBride's second Capra-based work, Frankly, Unmasking Frank Capra, which is new from Hightower Press. About Joseph McBride's newest work, James Nairmore wrote, quote, McBride is one of the great biographers of film directors, and in this book he gives us what you would call an autobiography of one of his biographies. Highly readable, at times absorbing, this book is valuable not only for what it reveals about the myth of Frank Capra, but also for what it shows about the way serious research can be blocked or inhibited by people and institutions who aren't interested in truth. Joe, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's great to be on your show, and I enjoy it, and I've enjoyed your magazine, Garrison. It's very terrific and promising, so I look forward to more.
Thank you so much. Everyone worked really, really hard, and I think we're all pretty pleased with the results, so thank you for that. So let's move on to Frank Capra, the subject of two fascinating works that you've now done. And I think Capra is a director whose work most people listening to us now will recognize. He did have a very mainstream appeal. He still does. He won 2 Academy Awards for Best Director for his works. Actually, he won 3 Academy Awards for Best Director for It Happened One Night, Mr. Deeds Goes to Town, and You Can't Take It With You. He did receive nominations for what I think many people would call his 2 most popular works, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and It's a Wonderful Life. The former lost to the behemoth of 1939, Gone with the Wind, while the latter was overtaken by The Best Year of Our Lives in 1946. Now, he's on AFI's 100 Years, 100 Movies list 3 times with It's a Wonderful Life, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and It Happened One Night. But you're a writer who has spent his career steeped in the history of Hollywood. You've done work on Howard Hawks and John Ford and Ernst Lubitsch and Steven Spielberg, and of course the 3 books on the great Orson Welles, one of my favorites. But what first drew you to the subject of Frank Capra?
I was always a big Capra fan myself. I think his greatest film is Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. When I interviewed him, he admitted to me that was his favorite film, too. He thought it was his best, even though he usually told people it's a wonderful life, because that's what they want to hear. By the way, both films, you mentioned Gone with the Wind and Best Years of Our Lives. For a while, Best Years of Our Lives was the second biggest grossing film in American film history after Gone with the Wind. Those were gigantic successes, and Best Years of Our Lives is a really great film, so it's understandable it would have lost to that, but it has this long life as a cult favorite. It took quite a while to become that, but Mr. Smith is a great political film, and Capra is an important political artist in America. That was one of the things that appealed to me. I like his mixture of comedy and drama, and I like his ability to move you. Francois Truffaut, the French director, said, "I've often wept during the serious moments of Frank Capra's comedies," which I think is a good way of explaining how he can do both very effectively. He's a great director of actors. He helped discover and make the careers of a lot of stars, such as Barbara Stanwyck, Jimmy Stewart, and on and on. And they give some of their best performances in his films. But he grappled with important issues in our culture, our country. He was an immigrant from Sicily, and he loved America, and America betrayed him, I found out, and he betrayed his principles. But the films deal with the Bill of Rights. For example, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington always stirs me because it's a powerful defense of the Bill of Rights, freedom of speech against tyranny and fascism in time of national crisis. And he was seen as the greatest filmmaker during the Depression era, or the emblematic director of the Depression era, speaking for the so-called common man, although, as he said, I didn't think he was common. I thought he was a hell of a guy. But the films have a proletarian streak and a lot of energy and kind of the struggle of the little guy against the system. All that is very powerful and effective, but the films are also very confused and contradictory in some ways politically, and I and other Capra admirers wondered about these contradictions, and people had trouble writing about him because of that. And I wrote a TV special, the American Film Institute's Salute to Frank Capra, which was the Life Achievement Award show in 1982. I wrote it with the producer, George Stevens Jr., and I got kind of bent out of shape trying to write this show because I was beginning to find out the truth about Capra was not exactly the man that we all thought he was, and I was trying to deal with that in the context of honoring him, which is an impossible task. I write about that in the new book, frankly. But I still like Capra's films, oddly enough. It may be paradoxical after exposing him as a fraud to a large extent, because I think I understand the films better, and the contradictions are clear to me why they exist, and it sharpens my perception of what's good and what isn't good in the films.
In reading about Capra, mainly from your works, he seems like he was a very conflicted man on so many issues. I think you've even used the word confused. Where was that sort of line of demarcation between who he wanted to be, or who he wanted to portray himself as being, and then who he really was?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. I mean, he didn't, I don't think, know, and that was part of his problem. He was a confused man in many ways, confused and contradictory. I mean, we all have contradictions, and we all have different sides to our personalities, which is one of the things that I explored in this book. That my biography, Frank Capra, The Catastrophe of Success, came out in 92 and took 7.5 years to write and research and fight the legal battle to get it out. But he was... One problem I realized he had was education. He knew enough as an immigrant in Los Angeles to know that education would be his pole vault to success, as he put it. And he really is admirable in the way he fought and struggled and got a good education in public schools in LA. And then he went to Troop Institute of Technology in Pasadena, which became Caltech later on. And that's an engineering school, and he wanted to be a chemical engineer. But he said there he discovered poetry. He had a great English teacher named Clinton Kelly Judy, who introduced him to literature and poetry. And he realized that he was more into that than he was into science. He wasn't as good at science as he wished he could have been. But I think that as admirable as that is, he didn't have a first-rate education in certain areas such as history and sociology, things that would have prepared him, political science would have prepared him for the role that he found himself in the 30s. Unexpectedly, he became this political pundit, and he wasn't ready for it, unlike, say, Steven Spielberg, who I did a biography on. Spielberg had a spotty education as well. He wasn't a great student, but somehow when he became, with Schindler's List, put him in this position of being kind of a public figure. And I mean, he was already a celebrated director, but it made people come to him and ask him serious questions about history and politics, and he was ready to answer them in a coherent way. He knew what he believed. He knew what he stood for. And Capra, I don't think, ever really knew what he believed, and he had great trouble expressing it. English was his second language, and that was part of a problem too for him. But he was very personable and charming, and great director of actors because he understood people quite well. I mean, that was, I think, his greatest strength as a director. He had other qualities that weren't as strong. He wasn't a great visual artist, I found. Even though some of his films have a lot of visual energy, that's mostly due to his cameraman, Joseph Walker, who doesn't get enough credit. But Capra was confused because he started out as this poor immigrant guy, but he exaggerated how poor his family was. That was one of the many, many myths that I found. He wrote an autobiography called The Name Above the Title in 1971 that came out, and everybody, it was a kind of surprise bestseller. A very kind of inspiring book, and everybody seemed to think this was a terrific book, and people believed it. And I was one of the people who was sort of fooled by it. And parts of it are a little hard to believe, as I had Jimmy Stewart say on our AFI tribute. But when you start looking into it, it's a work of fiction, basically. Almost nothing in it checks out. He rewrote his life the way he wished it would have been. Mm-hmm. And so I was digging into this, and one of the myths was how poor we were. Actually, his family, I found they owned 3 homes, and they weren't well off, but they were, getting by pretty well. And his mother worked extremely hard. His father was kind of a ne'er-do-well, but they rented a farm, and I mean, more damaging to Capra's integrity, in a sense, was he claimed he had no support from his family to go to college, and his sister and his mother actually gave him money, from their hard work to put him through college, and that's an example of, not giving credit where it's due. So he worked his way up the scale, and as he did that, unfortunately, he started looking down on fellow immigrants and poor people and people of different ethnic groups, and he developed a kind of dog-eat-dog personality. I mean, if you come from a poor beginning, sometimes it makes you empathetic, and sometimes it has the opposite effect. And if you're rich, like Franklin D. Roosevelt, you can still be empathetic, and sometimes it has the opposite effect. But Capra was very bigoted, and I found this out in talking to him. It didn't take me long talking to him to find out what a narrow-minded, bigoted man he was. You mentioned almost any ethnic group to him, and he would put them down, including his own Italian Americans. And I found that I did research on immigrant groups in that period in the early 1900s, and one of the tragedies they said was children sometimes would grow up, and I just heard somebody on the radio talking about this even today, contemporary story, children of immigrants looking down on their parents or having trouble relating to them because the children were more assimilated and the parents weren't, and a book that I read from 1919 about Italian American immigrants made that point, that sometimes causes contempt from the children toward their parents, and that's what he began to feel. He was ashamed of his parents. I said, "When did you get over being ashamed of your parents?" He said, "I still haven't yet," is what he said, which was chilling to hear. And I always love immigrant stories, and you have to admire his parents in a lot of ways. And but he grew up and identified with rich people, and he wanted to be a rich person, and started to insinuate himself into the worlds of wealthy people in Los Angeles, and found entrees into that world. And that's what he wanted to be, and that's what he became. He became wealthy, and he was conscious of the irony during the 30s, during the Depression, when quarter of the public were out of work. He was becoming a millionaire from movies that were celebrating the common man. But he always had an ambivalent attitude toward the common man. Actually, if you get into it, he feared the common man when they get together and start demanding action and become a mass. In Capra films, if you look at them, they become mobs and dangerous, which seems incongruous with the love of the common man. As individuals, they're often charming and admirable in his films, but as a group, he doesn't like them, and that's a sign of his republicanism, that he distrusted ordinary people. And he was a lifelong Republican, I found out, and he made $1 million in 1938. I interviewed his accountant and secretary, who was one of my best sources, and that's a tremendous amount of money in 1938. Very few people made that much money, and so and then he joined the army in World War II as a propagandist, and as one of his screenwriters said, his heroes then became the people who were the heavies in his own pictures. And he identified with the power elite and the establishment, and it really created problems for him that he didn't quite understand, because his films were saying one thing and he was thinking another. To me, the most stark example that I find this bizarre and interesting, he made a film called American Madness in 1932, and I was calling my biography that for a long time. It's a terrific film about a run on a bank and kind of a populist banker, which is sort of a contradiction in terms, but it's based on the founders of the Bank of America, who were Italian immigrants. And it's a guy who lends money on character rather than collateral. And that was Roosevelt's position in 1932, and he was the banking system was in great trouble. People were losing their savings, banks were failing, and Columbia made this film to support the Bank of America, which was their lender, and if the Bank of America had gone under, they might have gone under. So Capra makes this gripping film celebrating fluid currency. The banker says, take your money, put it in the bank, and then it goes to, we'll loan it to other people, and it's a real communal thing. And yet at the same time, I found Capra was keeping his own money at home under his mattress and in safe deposit boxes. He didn't trust banks. He didn't believe in his own movie. And he was putting out this propaganda, which was Rooseveltian propaganda, and he was voting against Roosevelt in 1932. I mean, it's astonishing that he voted for Herbert Hoover twice, and he voted for Alf Landon. And I mean, this is not the public image of Frank Capra that people love. So these are the kinds of things that I was getting into, and I found that a lot of the political orientation of these films was brought to him by the writers. And he worked with a lot of liberal writers and even some communist writers, a lot of left-wingers, and some conservatives. It was a kind of a spectrum of people he worked with. And Chester Stitch was his right-hand man for a long time, and he was one of my best sources. And he thought that was one of Capra's great strengths, was he was able to work with people of all kinds and different ideologies and synthesize them into good movies, and that's true. But that causes some internal contradictions in the films, and one reason people misunderstood the films, you'd see a Capra film, there'd be a kind of a liberal scene, then there'd be some kind of conservative scene, then there'd be another liberal scene, then there'd be some weird reactionary moment, and where is this coming from? And I was aware of that even as a naive Capra fan back in the 60s and early 70s. And well, that's because he had different writers working on them. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, I found it was written by a member of the Communist Party, Sidney Buckman, who later became blacklisted, and Capra informed on him, which was one of my big discoveries. He informed on some of his writers. And yet there are moments in Mr. Smith where there are some reactionary scenes, and that's because he was employing Miles Connolly, who's this far-right anti-communist guy who would sort of doctor his scripts, and Miles Connolly wouldn't always get credit, but he would write some dialogue and scenes. And Capra himself wrote some scenes. I was able to find out that he wrote a line about the Washington institutions. When Mr. Smith gets disillusioned, he calls it the whole rotten show, and Capra wrote that line. It was just a very strong, striking line about our system. And so that film is very complex politically because it stands for the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, and honest congressional action. and yet it depicts Congress as mostly corrupt and the press as corrupt, and the power structure is against the ordinary people, and so it's full of contradictions, but it has some very radical implications, and that made Capra uncomfortable in later years. And even when he was working on it, he was uncomfortable around Buckman because he knew he was a communist, and he was willing to work with him, which is to his credit. But he was worried that Buckman would slip in some communist propaganda, is what Buckman thought later, and they had a kind of a bitter confrontation over that. At one point, Buckman explained to him that the film was about protecting our smallest rights, because if you didn't do that, you would lose them, and then you'd lose all the bigger rights, you'd lose everything. And he said, that's my theme. And Capra said, go get fucked with your theme. And Buckman was shocked that Capra would say that. And then he started backing off, and he said, what I meant was, artists should not have political positions and, this kind of rhetoric. And Buckman said, well, how could you say that? Your favorite writer is Charles Dickens, and Capra collected rare books, and he collected Dickens's first editions. And Buckman said Dickens was a champion of the poor people, and he was an anti-Semite, but he was a champion of the working people. And anyway, Capra looked at him and just said, are you a communist? And Buckman turned to him and said, are you a fascist? And they left it at that. And that helps epitomize the contradictions in Capra, which I find really fascinating to study. Mm-hmm. And nobody had ever dug into this before, because nobody knew about all these contradictions until I started digging into them.
It's odd that Capra was a propagandist in World War II, but then I read elsewhere that he was a pacifist during the Vietnam era.
No, he was never really a pacifist. He claimed, I think what you're basing that on is he would run around to colleges when he did his book named by the title. It made him a star again, which was kind of the part of the point of the book. So he would appear on television, and he appeared at over like 125 campuses. And his fans were young, idealistic, liberal people of my generation, baby boomers. And so he would sort of act like a pacifist. He didn't ever denounce the Vietnam War. He would denounce war. He would say war is terrible, etc. Kind of anti-war rhetoric. But if you pressed him on it, like he gave a speech in 1966 at some college, and he actually disowned Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, because he said our country is bleeding right now because of all the turmoil over the Vietnam War, and I wouldn't make a film like that today because you don't want to do that when your country is bleeding. So he was as pro Vietnam War as Richard Nixon was, and he managed to pretend otherwise to some extent, but he also avoided being pinned down too much on specifics of these things. And John Ford, who I wrote a biography of, made a film on Vietnam called Vietnam, which was a propaganda film for the government, which was so embarrassingly simple-minded that they wouldn't even release it until the New York Times wondered why they didn't release it. And but I found in a letter that Ford had written to a friend, an old friend, he said, I really don't know what this war is about, but I don't get it at all. So he didn't really relate to the war, but he was supporting it because he thought that was his patriotic mission, and he was a Navy man, etc., and he had made propaganda in World War II. He was a more complex artist than Capra, but sometimes people get in these positions, and that period was full of anguish and violence and turmoil in America. The 60s and 70s, the Vietnam War was causing tremendous divisions and animosity, even worse than we have today. And so for Capra to really be anti-war would have been quite a thing, but he didn't actually do that. To be anti-Vietnam War, he was going to do a film after World War II based on the book The Friendly Persuasion by Jessamine West, who was a Quaker, and it's about Quakers in the Civil War, and it's about how they can stand up for their principles and not fight, since Quakers are pacifists. And Capra was going to make this film, and Michael Wilson wrote the script, and then Capra canceled it, and Wilson was blacklisted, and Capra informed on Michael Wilson as well, and Wilson told the House Committee on Un-American Activities, he said, I give this committee credit for the film not being made because it was a pacifist film, and and I think that your activities have made it impossible to make pacifist film in our country. So Capra had a streak of pacifism after the war, but, it was about the Civil War. And when the film was finally made by William Wyler, later they changed it so that the film became about a Quaker taking up arms and betraying his principles. As Pauline Kael rightly observed of that film, she said Quakers are only put into American films to betray their principles. So I'm not sure how far Capra would have gone with Wilson's script, but it made him uncomfortable. And one of the turning points I discovered in Capra's papers at Wesleyan University that I studied was when he found out that some of his writers were communists. I mean, he's a bit disingenuous because he knew about some of them already, but he was very worried after the war when the witch hunt began, 46, 47, and he dropped Friendly Persuasion, and Roman Holiday was another project he was going to do. That was actually written by Dalton Trumbo, who became one of the Hollywood 10, but Capra apparently didn't know that. His front was Ian McClellan Hunter, who was a communist writer who he chuckled to me and he said, could you imagine what Capra would have done if he had known that Dalton wrote that script, But Capra says I dropped those projects because I found out these writers were communists. And so he's hurting himself by refusing to do provocative projects. Roman Holiday was a fairly innocuous film, but it caused some controversy with the British because it was kind of a comedy about Princess Margaret's escapades in a disguised way. I mean, very innocuous, actually. But Capra was so fearful of anything that would cause controversy that he neutered his work after the war, and that's one reason he never made a good film after It's a Wonderful Life.
Joe, you've written that It's a Wonderful Life was a turning point of sorts in Capra's career, a very important one. But before I ask you about that, I'd like to play a modern trailer. Now, as much as I do love the original trailers, and I do, there's this sort of newer thing. I don't know if you've heard of this before. You probably have. There's a sort of newer thing where hobbyists create what they call modern trailers for older films. And this one was created for the film It's a Wonderful Life.
It's against the law to commit suicide around here.
Yeah, that's against the law where I come from, too.
Where do you come from?
Heaven?
What did you say just a minute ago? Why'd you want to save me?
Is it too much to have them work and pay and live and die in a couple of decent rooms and a bath? Anyway, my father didn't think so. This town needs this measly one-horse institution, if only to have some place where people can come without crawling to Potter. I'm leaving right now. I'm going to school. This is my last chance.
But they'll vote with Potter otherwise.
You can't laugh off this Bailey Park anymore.
Bailey family's been a boil on my neck long enough.
Do you realize what this means? It means bankruptcy and scandal and prison. That's what it means. I'm worth more dead than alive.
Why don't you go to the riffraff you love so much and ask them?
I suppose it'd been better if I'd never been born at all.
All right, you've got your wish. You've never been bored. You've been given a great gift, George. The chance to see what the world would be like without you.
I want to live again. Please, God, let me live again.
Were the HUAC years the reason why Capra's career takes a turn after It's a Wonderful Life?
Yeah, that's what I found out. And I was, newspaper reporter. I've been one since 1960, so I kind of have an eye for news. And I began wondering about Capra. I mean, I met him in 1975, and we were having lunch. I was interviewing him for Variety, and he was very charming, but we were at this very posh country club in Palm Springs, and he was telling me how he hated bankers and rich people, his whole Frank Capra rap, And this guy came over wearing a suit and says, Frank, I have the pictures of you playing golf with President Ford. So he shows him these pictures, and Ford was a Capra fan, and he had him to play golf. He had him to the White House once, and Capra said, "Oh, this is so great, Jerry. It's so terrific." And there was a picture of the president holding the pin while Capra putted, which I thought that's like the ultimate immigrant fantasy. Right. And he was saying, "Oh, it's so great." And then the guy left, and then Capra turned to me and said, "Where was I?" I said, "Oh, yeah, I was telling you how I hate bankers and rich people." And in a flash, I thought, this guy is not who he purports to be. This is a real contradiction. So I kind of made a mental note, find out more, and I began rereading Name Above the Title. And then when I started getting to know him better, when I did the AFI show in '82, I began questioning him and finding out all kinds of these contradictions. And so when I went to Wesleyan University in 1982, the first time when I was doing the Capra tribute, I looked at his papers, which had just recently been donated there, and nobody had really cataloged them. And I asked for the box about this. It was in early 1951. He went to India as a State Department propagandist to a international film festival, and in Name Above the Title there's a disturbing passage which talks about how his loyalty had been questioned. He was very vague about it, so he went over there to kind of prove his patriotic bona fides, basically. And he printed his excerpts from his diary, which are extremely strident anti-communist stuff, and he was waving the flag over there and combating communism at this film festival was his mission, he felt. And it just seemed so out of keeping with the Capra we thought we knew, that I thought, well, look at that box. This might be a key to something, that period. And sure enough, within 30 minutes or so, I had the story, the basic story, which is I found out evidence that he was an informer. And in 1951, he was part of a think tank called Project Vista for the Defense Department. They were planning strategy for World War III in Europe if we got into World War III as a top secret Caltech Defense Department project. And he was going to be the head of psychological warfare, and he was writing memoranda about what kind of propaganda films we should do, etc. And I found this document called the Security Board File. He had written an over 200-page document. His security clearance was revoked at that time, and he was not allowed access to top security material, which was a tremendous shock for him, and he writes about that in this document. So he's trying to clear his name, writing his history of his life and his political life in particular, and he's discussing his political philosophy and his party affiliation, lifelong Republican, anti-communist, Catholic, etc. And he has in there, he informed on several of his writers and a sound man, and said, I worked with these communists or people I thought might have been communists, and I'm sorry I did this, but I was fooled into working with them, etc. He goes into detail on each person, and this was evidence, shocking evidence of informing. And then he also has a letter in there in which he said, even the local FBI has called on me repeatedly for the purposes of passing on the loyalty of others. So he's admitting he's an FBI informer. Mm-hmm. And this answered my question about who is this guy and what is he trying to hide and what happened to his career. He got his clearance back tentatively. They kept still investigating him, but he was allowed back into the fold because he had performed this ritual of informing, but it wasn't public. It wasn't like Elia Kazan, who went before HUAC and took out an ad in the New York Times and naming names and saying this was, his duty to do this, and that caused a firestorm that lasts till today. But Kazan at least went public, and we know what he did. And but Capra didn't, so he hid the evidence, but he released it to this archive, the Wesleyan University Cinema Archives, along with a lot of supporting documentation about those events and all kinds of other revealing documents, including his longer version of his autobiography in which he talks about those events and other things. So in a sense, I felt he was subconsciously confessing or telling the truth to the public by releasing his papers to this archive. And that is to his credit that he did that. It's an interesting moral question. Who is better person, Kazan because he was frank about his informing, or Capra because he was ashamed of it and tried to cover it up? It's an interesting question. But informing is informing, and Capra was ashamed of it on some deep level. enough to keep it from the public, and he didn't. Kazan boasted about it, and Kazan admitted he said there was something disgusting about it, but he tried to give defenses of it. A very different approach, and so I started looking into the papers, and then when I began thinking there's a biography that needs to be written, in '84 I started doing it, and I went to the archives and started looking through I read all the papers for more than 2 months, and they started. The archivist Janine Basinger was running the archives. She started the archives, and she's still at Wesleyan, but she's kind of stepped aside from running it. Mm-hmm. But she started blocking me from seeing certain documents, like that security board file. Was withheld from me the second time I went there, and she started being uncooperative. She promised, in a nutshell, I'd have permission to quote from his unpublished works, which Wesleyan owned. According to the deed of gift, Frank and his wife Lou gave the papers and all the publication rights to the university, and but she started, Janine Basinger, saying that she was being difficult about permissions for years. She never actually said no, and this was part of the Kafkaesque nightmare of the whole thing that I document in this new book, Frankly, Unmasking Frank Capra. I go into literally about 4 years of legal battling over these papers and trying to get the rights to quote them, because I had written a very long manuscript in which I quoted from a lot of letters and correspondence and a lot of manuscripts that Capra wrote, etc. And she would never quite say yes and never quite say no, and playing all kinds of games. And my publisher was Alfred A. Knopf, which is one of the supposedly great publishers in the country. And Robert Gottlieb was my editor, who's the most celebrated American book editor, who's still working, and he's Robert Caro's editor on the Lyndon Johnson biography, which I really admired the first volume a great deal, and the Robert Moses biography that Caro wrote, all kinds of great books. And so Knopf was blocking me too. They were playing these games in league with her and trying to stop me from just getting permission, and they were mysteriously, to some extent, kowtowing to her and knuckling under and taking her side against the author. This is to kind of simplify a very complex situation, which I write about in detail. I think it's a very instructive story about our country, and we think we live in a free country with free speech, but it's not quite as simple. If you try to write a book about an iconic American figure that is exposing that person, it may be very difficult for you to get the book published or sold. At least I sold it, and then they wouldn't, they kept, in effect, not wanting to publish it, but they wouldn't ever say we don't want to publish it. And Robert Caro gets his books out and exposes a lot about Johnson, had controversies, but Knopf supported him in that, but they didn't support me, which was surprising. And so I was battling my publisher, and I was battling this archivist, and I finally won. I had a good lawyer, and my wife, Dr. Ruth O'Hara, who's a psychologist at Stanford today, she works for Stanford, and she and I and my lawyer, Maury Mealy, fought this battle to get this book out. And my brother, Mike McBride, is a lawyer, too, and he also helped me. And we beat the biggest publisher in America, Random House, which was the parent of Knopf at that time. And we took the book away from them and went to Simon & Schuster, which was an honest publisher, and published the book. I had to take out a lot of direct quotes from Capra's unpublished works because I couldn't get permission, and I had to summarize them in my own words. But I think that actually helped the book because, frankly, I'm a better writer than Capra, and I was able to, make a lot of his sort of woolly language more succinct and put it into, I couldn't paraphrase it in the sense that, it couldn't be a close approximation because the copyright laws changed also while I was writing the book. And historians and biographers used to have more freedom to quote from unpublished material and to paraphrase things. You couldn't paraphrase too closely, but you could paraphrase to some extent. But after that, I was told you have to summarize, and fair use doesn't really exist, or at least on a practical level, fair use for unpublished material, I found was not something I could rely upon. There is fair use for published material. You can use a certain amount of text from a book or an article without permission. So I had to do a major rewrite on the book, but I think the book became better for that, but it was quite an ordeal, as you can imagine.
So in 1992, your biography of Frank Capra was finally released. Its title is Frank Capra, The Catastrophe of Success. But in a way, Joe, after all that you went through to publish this important work, The Catastrophe of Success could have also described that journey from idea to bookstore shelf, could it not?
Well, yeah, I guess it depends on how which word you put in what order, because the book was a success. It got terrific reviews, and even better than I expected, which was very gratifying. After such a long time, I didn't know what to expect, but the reviews were sensational, and I was very gratified. People were very taken by the book and the revelations. A lot of good serious reviews. It was catastrophic in a sense, because it took up 4 years of my life fighting this legal battle, and my finances and my health and all kinds of things, and my family and other people, paid the price as well. But it had a happy ending in a sense. The book came out, so that's the difference, I guess. Capra's life. The reason I chose that title, when I went to Simon & Schuster, I was calling it American Madness: The Life of Frank Capra. And my editor there, Bob Bender, who's an excellent editor, said, well, I don't think this title is exactly right, because Capra was not mad, and it sounds a little, misleading or whatever. And I said, well, it's about America, the madness of patriotism, et cetera. And he said, well, could we come up with a better title? So he said, how would you describe this book? And I thought about it, and I thought of a phrase from Tennessee Williams when he did Streetcar Named Desire. He wrote a piece for the New York Times called On the Catastrophe of Success, which was about his experiences after becoming a big success overnight with the Glass Menagerie, and how that changed his life. You'd think success is what you live for and what you dream of, and yet it caused him all kinds of anxiety and self-doubt and exposure and all kinds of problems that arose, and depression, and he overcame it and wrote another great play soon after that, Streetcar Named Desire, and then he had a great career and went on. He had a lot of ups and downs, but he went on. But Capra, when he made It Happened One Night, that was his equivalent to the Glass Menagerie. Suddenly Capra became a famous man. He won the Academy Award. The film won Best Picture, won the 5 major Oscars. It was a runaway hit. And he had been toiling, making genre films and things that were good, but he wasn't a household name. And suddenly he was this big shot household name. And rather than gratify him, it sent him into a tailspin. He got very ill. And he claims in his book it was psychosomatic, but it was actually a very serious physical illness that he had. He almost died from it, but it was exacerbated by depression and a feeling of insecurity and a feeling of inadequacy, which was a carryover from his youth and also from his fraudulence. And I studied this. It's called the imposter syndrome by psychologists. That this afflicts often people who are successful. They feel that they're frauds and they're having success they don't deserve, because they realize that either they are an actual fraud or else they feel like it in a neurotic way. And Capra was affected by that. And so he went into, psychological, physical tailspin, and he did pull out of it and started to make some other really good films. Mr. Deeds Goes to Town and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. But he had some other problems. He started shooting too many takes and spending too much money, and Lost Horizon was actually a debacle. People didn't really know the story there, and I found out it was kind of Capra's Heaven's Gate. It went way over budget and way over shooting schedule, and he turned in a 6-hour cut of the film, and he didn't know how to finish it, and there was a disastrous preview, and the studio took it out of his hands, which made him extremely upset, and I wrote a very detailed chapter on this unknown episode. And Capra left Columbia partly because of all these problems, and he thought he was getting too big for Columbia, and he wanted to be independent, which didn't work out for him because, like a lot of contract Hollywood directors, he actually functioned best in the studio system. Jimmy Stewart said that to me. He thought that was Capra's problem. But when he went independent, he had to do a lot of the stuff on his own without the support of the studio, and he wasn't ready for it, and financially it was difficult for him too. And he went into the Army as kind of a welcome relief. He didn't have to think for himself or be independent. He could just follow orders, and unfortunately he did that so well that he came out of the Army without much of a personality left. I felt that he had been following orders for so long he didn't know what he thought about anything. He did make one more really good movie, It's a Wonderful Life, which is a very personal film about a man who's suicidal and doesn't realize the success that he really is. It has elements of Capra's story. So he did one more terrific film, It's a Wonderful Life, which is very personal, and he talked about that a lot. But when you look at the film, as another critic, William S. Pechter, said, if you don't believe in angels, it's about a man committing suicide. And it's a man who is a good man who's successful in his small town and does a lot of good for people. He doesn't quite realize how successful his life is until people tell him at the end of the film. But he thinks of himself as a failure, and it has sort of this wild oscillation of elation and depression, the kind of manic depression quality that is evident in other Capra films too. You see that in Mr. Deeds and Mr. Smith, and that's one reason I always like Capra films, because I think that's true to life. That kind of life is full of highs and lows, and Capra captures that really well. But after It's a Wonderful Life, he didn't go anywhere thematically. He just kind of shut down, and he literally said he didn't want to work with liberals anymore because they got him in trouble. And if you don't want to work with liberal writers in Hollywood, you're kind of stuck, because most of the writers in Hollywood were liberals.
Absolutely.
And so he was stuck with working with Miles Connolly pretty much, who was the right-winger. And Capra started canceling promising projects because they were dodgy, and started trying to do all kinds of goofy projects. It was a very depressing story. I read all the projects that he tried to do in the 50s and 60s that the studios turned down, and he as some people do when you have a crisis, he found God again. He had been raised as a Catholic but had left the church and came back to religion in the early 50s when he was very anti-communist. Of course, a lot of anti-communists were Catholic or Christian, thought that the communists were godless, atheists, etc. That was going on. So Capra became very religious, and he started trying to do all kinds of religious projects in the 50s. And they were making Bible movies and things, and some of them were successful. But Capra wasn't able to sell the projects that he wanted to do. A lot of them were very corny and schmaltzy, semi-ridiculous stories. The one that I kind of wished I had seen was The Life of St. Paul, starring Frank Sinatra. That would have been interesting.
Yes. I can only imagine.
I can only imagine. It could have been one of the worst films of all time, but maybe a good film. Who knows? Ring-a-ding-ding, here's Frank on the road to Damascus. But then he tried to do some political stories, too. He wanted to do one that sounded like a kind of interesting story, which was he wanted to get Elvis Presley to play a rock singer who is used as a political demagogue to fool the youth of America. Now, that could have resulted in a terrible movie, too, but it could have been interesting, like Face in the Crowd, the Kazan film. Kazan and Schulberg, both informers themselves, made this very interesting film about political hysteria. I don't think Capra had the sense that they had politically in terms of understanding problems, to make a good movie out of it. So the studios just wouldn't do these projects, and he basically blacklisted himself and left Hollywood for Fallbrook, California, which is south of L.A. He had a ranch, and he semi-retired. He was making children's science shows for television, which are sort of okay, but they're very childish, and he became frustrated doing that, and then he got involved in a political controversy in Fallbrook that I discovered. That drove him back to Hollywood, and then he had a very unhappy last few years in Hollywood making films that were just terrible, A Hole in the Head and Pocket Full of Miracles, and then he retired. But it took him 5 years after Pocket Full of Miracles. He was flogging projects, and he couldn't get them done. It's a very depressing story. So you have a guy who was tremendous success for about the first 45 years of his life, and then the second 45 years roughly was a downhill slide. And I condensed a lot of that into the last chapter. Was the hardest to write in a sense because I had to deal with about 40 years of his life in one, complex but succinct chapter. And the book starts with him in the 70s, and then it flashes back. But if you wrote it at the same level of detail I had done with the 30s films where he's actually doing things, it would be excruciatingly dull because it's a life of frustration and failure and going to film festivals and things like that, giving speeches at colleges. It just, he couldn't get much done. But it became a very interesting chapter of what happens when your life collapses.
Joe, you would have not been blamed at all had you put this story to rest in 1992 upon publication, I'm sure. You've had a very successful career, and as I said earlier, I think you're the best biographer of directors that we have today. But the challenges you went through with Knopf, your publisher, and then Gottlieb, your editor, and Basinger, the archivist, when it was finished, that could have very well been the end for you and your work on Capra. It would absolutely have been understandable had it been. But you return to the story in the writing of Frankly, Unmasking Frank Capra. Why?
Yeah, I've been carrying this story around for a long time with me because that was over in 92, and I had tremendous amount of documentation. My lawyers advised me to keep a paper trail. That's a very good phrase, and I use it for the first chapter. In other words, keep all the documents, keep all the correspondence, take notes on everything. Every time I had a phone conversation with my publishers, or with my agent, or anybody, my lawyers, I would keep voluminous notes. And since I'm a long-time newspaper reporter, I have good notes on everything. And thought this was a good story. But at the time, I was willing to tell it to people, oddly enough, but nobody asked. Like, did you have any problems writing this book? And nobody asked, so I didn't tell them. And it was so painful that, in a sense, I wanted to put it behind me. But, I mean, I never wanted to abandon the biography, which that's another interesting question I raised in my book. Why didn't I just walk away from it? And I couldn't have done that. It meant too much to me, and I'm a very stubborn guy when it comes down to it, and I've prevailed in certain crises in my life by not giving in. But after it was over, I moved on to other books, the Spielberg book and the John Ford biography, etc. And I began teaching at San Francisco State, and I keep writing books, but this one was kind of gnawing at me that I should tell this story because it's an important episode of my life, but it's also an important story about publishing and how the truth is dealt with in America or stifled, and film history. And I was also influenced by a couple of people. Somebody said after the book came out, the first book, they said, there's one chapter missing. And I said, what's that? And the guy said, how you wrote this book. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And he said, well, that's part of Capra's story too, isn't it? And I thought, yeah, the guy had a good point. I couldn't have told it in one chapter very well, but also Charles Champlin, who is the arts editor of the LA Times, is a friend of mine, and I offered him serialization rights to part of the book for a while. And he said, well, it's too complex for us to run, but how about you write an article called Looking for Frank about how you're trying to do this book? And I thought, that's good. He didn't really know what was going on, but I began thinking of this. This is a story in itself, and it is part of Capra's life. When you think about it, it's, he had a series of strokes in 1985, but for a year I interviewed him, and he was quite forthcoming in some ways, and then he lied a lot, and he tried to cover things up, and it was this kind of jousting that we had going on. It was funny in some ways because he was eager to talk. He was kind of lonely, and he was, he was flattered that I knew so much about his work, and I was investigating his life. And he would ask me questions like, I said, I just saw this woman who you knew in college and interviewed her, and he'd say, oh, what did she think of me, or what did she say about me? And he was fascinated by this stuff. But then I would say, like, one of his lies was he didn't have a girlfriend in college because he was working so hard, which was nonsense. He actually had a girlfriend who was, I interviewed her at length, and she said she was one of the reasons he didn't do well in school because he was spending too much time with me, which was true. And but this other lady talked about a double date Capra went on with her, and whoever he was dating, and he was making out very heavily in the front seat with this blonde, and I told Capra, and he said, well, she was making out pretty heavily in the back seat too. And he remembered this incident really well, but he wasn't about to volunteer this until I got it from this witness. And so gradually I would get the truth from interviewing 175 people, including a lot of people he worked with in filmmaking, but also a lot of so-called ordinary people. Before I came along, film biographies, they never interviewed regular people. They just interviewed stars or directors. And I was under the influence of Caro's first book on Johnson, where he has a terrific section at the beginning where he goes to the hill country in Texas and interviewed a lot of people about what life was like when Johnson started out in politics and how he brought electricity to the hill country, which was one of the great achievements of his career. But it was tied up with political corruption, too, so it was a mixture of things. But great material that he got from regular people about how politics influences their life. And so I was interviewing people Capra grew up with and went to school with at grade school, high school, college, and putting together the story of his apprenticeship in filmmaking, which took several years, which he totally lied about in his book. That was actually the hardest interview job, hardest research job I had, but very interesting to find out how he really rose through the ranks. He claimed he just walked into a studio and said, I'm a director, and got a job, which is, people still believed that nonsense, but it's not the way it happened. He worked himself up from literally, as he admitted, cleaning up the horse shed at a studio. Mm-hmm. Once I found out, I said, you worked for this company and you did this and this, and then he would tell me, oh yeah, I did this and this and this. And so I was getting all the stories, and then he would sometimes try to mislead me, and then I would find out, and then he would tell me more honest things. So it was a kind of a serious game we played, but this was part of Capra's story, is this revelation of who he was and his dealing with a biographer, unauthorized biographer, who's challenging him, and then people working on his behalf, his archivist and a publisher who was in league with her, and members of the Capra family were trying to block my book as well. And that's part of Capra's story, how you try to stop the truth from coming out. And then he lived on until 1991 in a very diminished state, and I wasn't allowed to see him after 85, although I talked to him on the phone once. But I got almost everything I needed from him. But that's part of his story, is the latter part of his life. So this book is a kind of parallel biography. I think of it as a sort of sequel to my first biography, but it's a 2-volume biography of Capra. And I tell a lot of things in the course of the second book, frankly, Unmasking Frank Capra. I go into a lot of details about things that I didn't put in the first book, and I quote. I have a lot of quotes from Capra in the second book that aren't in the first book, etc. And I did additional research, for example, in the files of the House Committee on Un-American Activities, and I talk about other discoveries that I and other people made since my book came out. So it's a kind of a parallel life of Frank Capra, the two lives. If you're interested in his life, you should read both books, I think.
Yes, I would suggest reading both books as well, and we'll have links to both in the show notes. But in describing the struggle that you went through to write a truthful telling of Capra's work in person, and it's still hard to say that. It's still hard to believe that you went through such a struggle to write what is, in essence, the truth about a director. But in doing so, you've been quoted as saying, I believe in writing about an injustice or some false conception that needs to be corrected. Stories that stir my passion for telling the truth. And I laugh because I think that that's the purpose of many nonfiction writers who are finding it increasingly harder to get work published because they're trying to retell history in a truthful way. So where do you see nonfiction writing actually going for an historian or for a writer who simply just wants to go against the grain or go outside the accepted box and write truth?
Well, that's a great question. I have a whole chapter at the end of the book on writing film biographies, writing directors' lives. And I grapple with some of these questions that we deal with as biographers and what other biographers have done, and some of the hostility toward biography, too, that in the media and from sources, people don't want their lives told, or family members trying to block them. I'm not the only person this has ever happened to. There have been a number of famous incidents where people have tried to stop biographies. And I think there are a lot more of these incidents than we know, that usually people don't talk about them. And, nobody really knew the story of my Capra Michigas until I wrote this book, because I was keeping it quiet. I thought it was more effective to just get the book out than to hold press conferences and things, which I could have done, I considered doing. But I think it's instructive because other biographers now are telling me, I had this problem with so-and-so and I tried to write a book on so-and-so. But often, too, books come out that are compromised. I mean, you say, and this is really true, that we should all be in the business of trying to tell the truth and reveal true history. But what is true history? That's a big debate, too. History is what we make of it. Right. And I'm not a relativist in the sense that I believe there is no such thing as truth. I think there is. You can get to the truth, but history is a it's a story that we tell ourselves that is based on hopefully facts, but a lot of things that pass as history are false. And I really believe that all of the major events in American history since 1960 are the official stories are false, and we've been fed lies about them. And so a lot of writers do very well for themselves by printing books that are demonstrably false, and they may or may not realize it. I think some of them are cynical enough that they know better about, say the Kennedy assassination, which we're both interested in, right. But they will claim the opposite of what they actually know, or they don't want to go near it. One thing you find in books on John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy is they'll say, well, he died in 1963 in an assassination. Boom. They won't say anything about it. They don't say who did it or whatever. Robert Kennedy, the same thing. He was shot in 1968. And it's a way of evading responsibility, because when if your subject is murdered, you would think that whoever it is, that would be a major focus of your biography. But that's really the third rail of American politics, to deal with things like that. If you're a mainstream writer like Robert Caro, disappointed me in his fourth volume on Johnson, where he buys into the Warren Commission version of the Kennedy assassination. And he may believe that, but I think he's blinding himself to reality. But some people do it willingly, and some people just, they've drunk the Kool-Aid they've read other books and they just repeat things. Like, I've done a lot of research into George H.W. Bush's life, and I've broken some fresh ground there, but most of the books on him are just false nonsense propaganda. Right. But the writers may believe this crap, because people tend to believe official lies. So that's a problem for us. And the problem of authorized biography is something I go into. I would never write an authorized biography. And a lot of people you run into, they think there's something wrong with an unauthorized biography. They think that's there's something shady about it, or something scandalous, that you're going to, people who do that are scandal mongers or whatever. But frankly, and to use that word again, is how I approach things. If you wrote an authorized biography, you'd be beholden to the subject or whoever owns the rights to the papers or the material, whatever. And I would never want to do that, because it would compromise the book. And even Robert Gottlieb, when we were working on the Capra book, he told me there's always a price to be paid for an authorized biography. And he really was kind of tipping his hand there, but he claimed that they don't do authorized biographies at Knopf. And I began noticing in the acknowledgments of a lot of Knopf books that most of them were authorized biographies, but they often say things like, well, this book was authorized and I thank the children of so-and-so for giving me access to the papers or whatever, but they never asked for to review the book, and they never asked me to change anything. And I just don't believe that stuff, because there's, as Godley says, there's always a price to be paid. So in effect, my book was, it was a completely trying to be as honest as I could, dig as deeply into the papers as I could, and into the historical research. And I found out there's a tremendous paper trail on all of us if you just, I really I dotted every I and crossed every T that I could. And Gottlieb, at one point, this really bothered me. He said, you know it all, you may know too much. And I was shocked that my editor would say something like that. First of all, how does he know that I know it all? He hasn't done the research. Did somebody tell him this? And I mean, it's a compliment in a way, and I did know it all pretty much. And then he says, you may know too much. How could you know too much if you're a biographer trying to do a really good book? That's a very strange thing for an editor to say. And then he told me, the slasher will go to work. And he bragged at one point about how much he had cut from Caro's book on Robert Moses, which is a great book, terribly long book. But, I began realizing my publisher was working against me. And this happens to authors too. But I had never authorized this book. And if I had done that, I would have been helpless to stop this from happening. But I finally thought that what had happened, and part of my new book is sort of a mystery story in a way of the author trying to find out what the forces arrayed against him were really doing. They didn't want to come out and say we're doing X, Y, and Z because they would have been exposed to more legal jeopardy and financial jeopardy. They were exposed to a lot of it anyway. But, I had to ferret out the truth and dig out the truth through all the lies they told me. And I go into this Kafkaesque Byzantine tale. I concluded that they had kind of made some kind of deal clandestinely with the Capras and the archive to, in a sense, treat it as an authorized book that Janine Basinger, the archivist, would help edit or veto certain things, and they were hoping to take the book away from me through some kind of maneuver and control it themselves and put out a sanitized version that would maybe spill the beans on some things about Capra, but conceal the really big news, such as the fact that he was an informer in the blacklist period, and they wanted to cut that out. And I began finding out as gradually I was playing like a game of chess with my publisher. They were starting to urge me to cut certain things out of the book, etc. And so I think in their head it somehow had become an authorized book, but without telling the author, which is totally illegal, of course. But that's what they were trying to do, and they were trying to maneuver me in a position where they could say I was being uncooperative and we have to take the book away from him. But I was making sure that wouldn't happen because I was trying every way I could to make them adhere to their contract and publish the book as I wrote it. And I was willing to, work with them in the editing, but they weren't working with me in a meaningful way. They were just trying to, censor great chunks of the book.
And who is Hightower Press?
Well, that's me. I published 21 books now in my life. I've been writing books since 1963. Published with a lot of major publishers, Simon & Schuster, St. Martin's Press. Last year I had a book from Columbia University Press, How Did Lubitsch Do It?, about Ernst Lubitsch, the great director. Mm-hmm. And but there are several books. This is my fourth book now that I've published myself. I like the freedom of that, and there's certain kinds of books that are very unconventional that you might have a hard time getting a conventional publisher to do. So I published my book on the Kennedy assassination, Into the Nightmare, My Search for the Killers of President John F. Kennedy and Officer J.D. Tippit, in 1963. And that's a book I worked on for 31 years, kind of on the side of all these projects. Even while I was doing the Capra book, I was doing research on that. And that's done very well. And I've also published a memoir called The Broken Places, which is a story of my troubled youth, which I've been working on for a long time. Again, I have the projects that I've been working on off and on for many years, and things that really mean a lot to me personally, and I wouldn't want to have censored or neutered or sanitized or whatever. And that book is, a lot of people admired manuscript of that project, but they were afraid of it in some ways because of some very graphic things in it and very disturbing things. And then I did a book called Two Cheers for Hollywood, Joseph McBride on Movies, which is a collection of my highlights of my shorter works over the years from magazines and some new material. I've done many articles and reviews, and I've put together a big book of those. And then this new book, frankly, Unmasking Frank Capra. So what I do, and this is, I think, a terrific thing. And actually, my very first book was self-published. It was called Persistence of Vision, a collection of film criticism, which came out in 1968. And I was the head of the Wisconsin Film Society at the University of Wisconsin, and we had published two books before, which we self-published. we hired a printer in Madison to print them. And so we did that with this third book of mine, Persistence of Vision. And I just didn't know how to promote it at that time because, bookstores will not carry self-published books, or at least they wouldn't then. And we didn't have the internet. And it was reviewed in a couple film magazines, and some libraries wanted to carry it, but it was really hard to do a self-published book then. There was a stigma attached to it because it was considered vanity publishing, And but now two great things happened in recent years. One is computer technology. You can you write the book on a computer, and then you have a designer design it and make camera-ready copy that lays it out, looks like a book, and is very professional looking and well designed. You can design the cover, and so I work with an art director, Maggie Hurley, who's terrific at designing books, and she makes them. I think it's very important how a book looks, how people regard it, and so you can do that, and then you hire a print-on-demand company. They're called fulfillment houses, and the company I work with is called Vervante. They're in Utah, and they do a terrific job. And I was recommended by a friend of mine who had a book with them, and so you make a deal with them to publish the book for X amount of money, and they print it and do a very good job, and then it's sold through Amazon. And that to me was a big moment when Amazon started selling self-published books from print-on-demand companies, because you can get the book out there to the whole world. Anybody in the world can go on Amazon and buy a book. And so Into the Nightmare, for example, sells a lot to foreign countries. A lot of people around the world are interested in the Kennedy assassination and the Tippit murder. And so I get orders from Iceland and Spain and, all over the place. And so they buy it through Amazon, and then Amazon contacts the fulfillment house who then send out the book, and then the author gets a share of it. And so you control the distribution, you control the printing, you control the editing, and you get a decent share of the proceeds, and Amazon takes a share, and the fulfillment house does too. And it's a very good operation, I think, for everybody, and it enhances freedom of speech, I think, because certain books can get published that maybe couldn't have gotten published before.
Yes, I also like the print-on-demand option. It's something I'm currently looking into as well for the magazine and for a few other projects. So I do see the advantages for a writer or, say, an independent publisher having more control. For someone who wants to really just get the truth out there, it seems to be a really positive thing. So I'll be looking into that. But I want to move on to your work regarding George Herbert Walker Bush. Now, you unmasked Frank Capra, but I also think you've unearthed George Bush. So we'll get into your work, Into the Nightmare, a great book, the next time you're on with us, because I think it's deserving of an entire episode. But I want to take you back to a time when you were working on Frank Capra, The Catastrophe of Success. The year was 1985, and you were conducting some research for the biography at the Cal State San Bernardino Library. And as any researcher does, and as I've done many times, you kind of went down a rabbit hole, or as Russ Baker called it in Family of Secrets, a time-consuming tangent. Just what were you doing, and more importantly, what did you find?
Well, I started seriously researching the Kennedy assassination in 1982 to do a book about it. I had been interested since even before the assassination. I actually wrote a short story in 1961 for freshman high school English class about Kennedy's assassination. This was October 61. It was called The Plot Against a Country. And it imagined his assassination, and it wasn't a very good story, but it was sort of prescient. I think because I had worked for him in 1960 as a volunteer in the Wisconsin primary, and got to meet him and see him up close, I was aware of his vulnerability, I think. And I was also a student of the Lincoln assassination, so I was aware of historical forces and precedents, and so I was worried about this happening, and then it happened. And I studied it sort of in a casual way over the years and read other books about it. And in the 70s, when Watergate occurred and the Church Committee started investigating CIA involvement in assassinations, et cetera, I became more focused on how these things work. And so I began buying these reports and the House Select Committee report, and I was researching it, but it came together in 82. I thought, okay, I'll do a book on this, and really got serious and started going to Dallas and to the National Archives. Back then you didn't have documents you could get online. You had to go to the archives and get Xerox copies and go through all kinds of papers, which is, good research, and I love doing that kind of thing. But I had to finance this myself, and that's what I do with these self-published books. These are books that, or even when I do a book that I'm going to, like the Lubitsch book, I didn't ask anybody, can I do a Lubitsch book? I just started doing it, and then after writing it, I sold it to Columbia University Press. That's what I prefer to do. And that's how I started my career. When you do a biography, you often need an advance. So you write a proposal, which I did for the Capra book, and you get, because there's so much money, so much expense involved in writing a biography that you're beholden to a publisher. But this episode with the Capra book kind of taught me I didn't really like being that beholden. But so I was researching Kennedy and, on the side, and reading about it every day and thinking about it. And in 85, I was living in San Bernardino Mountains near LA writing my book on Capra, and I would come down the mountain to shop and go into LA and do research. And there was a library nearby, the Cal State San Bernardino Library, and I was also using the USC library, and they both had microfilm of FBI files that had come out in the assassination in 77 and 78. Certain libraries bought these microfilm copies. And so I was going through them, and just like I did with, looking for things in Capra's files. And in 85, I came upon documents that showed that George H.W. Bush had been with the CIA long before we knew. And I wasn't fully up on his career at the time, but there was an extraordinary document I found November 29th, 1963, from J. Edgar Hoover about a briefing that had been given to Mr. George Bush of the CIA and a couple of other people about the reaction of the anti-Castro Cubans to the assassination, what they might do. The government was ostensibly worried about that. It's a long story there, but... and then I began finding other documents. I thought, well, George Bush, CIA, 1963, that's interesting. Was he with them? I didn't quite know. So then I began going through more of these, and I found more and more FBI documents on George Bush. And I found this whole story about him turning in the head of the Young Republicans in Houston. Bush was the head of the Harris County Republican Party, which was Houston. And his head of the Young Republicans, James Parrott, Bush called the FBI at 1:45 in the afternoon of the assassination and said Parrott had been talking about killing Kennedy when he came to Texas. And so the FBI went out and investigated Parrott, and they felt that he had an alibi. They thought he was with his mother at the time in Houston. But I thought this is a very strange story. I mean, if somebody told you, I'm thinking of killing the president when he comes to town, wouldn't you call the Secret Service or, local police instead of waiting until after it happens? And here's a guy who's running for the Senate, and he's the head of the Republican Party. And so I began thinking this is very interesting. And then I began looking into Bush's career, and I found out that officially he never had anything to do with the CIA until he became its director in the 1970s. Gerald Ford appointed him director of the CIA. And then I looked up his hearing for when he was appointed, and he said he had no experience in intelligence, which seems strange. Even some people at the time said, well, wait, isn't this kind of strange? A guy's appointed head of the CIA with no background in intelligence agencies. That's incongruous. And then I began thinking, there's a story here that this guy was with the CIA before he admits, what's up with that? But I was so busy with the Capra book, I didn't do anything with it until 88, Bush is running for president. He had been vice president, was vice president at the time, and I thought, well, there's a story here, so let's look into it further. And I began doing more research. This is while I was in the time when I was being legally blocked from getting the Capra book out. So I spent some time working on Bush, and I put together, I thought The Nation would be a good place to print it because, for one thing, it's kind of left-wing political magazine, but they also published an article about the Bay of Pigs invasion before it happened. I was impressed by that they and a couple of other outlets knew that it was in preparation, and they blew the whistle on it, and I was impressed. So I wrote this piece revealing Bush's early CIA connections, and I called Victor Navasky, the editor of The Nation, and he was immediately interested, and I sent it to him, and he ran it, and it caused quite a stir. It got a lot of attention in the press, covered in the Associated Press, the New York Times, most news outlets reported on this. And the CIA, I called them and I called the vice president's office, and they wouldn't confirm or deny it. The CIA would not confirm or deny it. That's their usual position when somebody is said to be a CIA agent or operative or contact or whatever. And then the vice president's office kind of stonewalled me. So for about 10 days there was a stir of interest. This was right during the campaign. And I honestly I was hoping to stop Bush from becoming president because I could see the future. My son said, I predicted everything that happened after that. I didn't predict 9/11, but I could see a lot of wars in the future, and I did a lot of other research on the Bush family, and I found out a lot of other things, and it was very hard to research them because they've covered their tracks very well, and I was frustrated. But when I went to Washington that summer, C-SPAN called me and they put me on. Brian Lamb, the head of C-SPAN, interviewed me, and that got a lot of national attention for the story. And while I was there, I spent time going through the National Archives and other places and interviewing people about Bush and finding out more, but I was also frustrated. I ran into a lot of dead ends with my research. I couldn't prove things that I knew to be true or heard to be true, that a lot of them came out later that other people managed to get. But I was hoping the mainstream media would run with it, but they didn't. And then the CIA, after the C-SPAN thing, came out and said, well, it was a different George Bush. And this was pretty unusual for them to say anything about such a claim. But they also identified this man, George W. Bush, who was not, the guy who became president, but another George William Bush. But they said, we don't know where he is, which is kind of peculiar too. If the CIA can't find somebody. And I found this guy pretty quickly. Somebody at the NSA tipped me off where he was. And I interviewed him, and he said, well, it wasn't me in that memo. I didn't get that briefing. He was a low-level CIA employee at the time Kennedy was shot, but it wasn't him. He said, is that the other George Bush? So I wrote a second article proving that the CIA was wrong in saying it wasn't the guy who became vice president. But the media, then the mainstream media, had gotten afraid of this story and basically dropped it like a hot potato. And I was hoping Michael Dukakis' campaign might make it an issue, but they were afraid of it as well. So it kind of died. But I knew what would happen, that this story would, within 10 years or so, other people would start picking it up and running with it, and I'd be vindicated. And I had complete confidence in that. And that's what happened. People writing books about Bush and Kennedy assassination and various related topics began looking into his CIA connections. It opened a whole new door onto researching Bush and his family, that nobody knew anything about this stuff. And people started coming up with things that I didn't know. His connections with the CIA were even extended farther into the past than I knew before. And people began finding out things about Parrott, et cetera. And when I went to see Parrott, I went to Houston in '88 and tried to go. I wanted to interview him, but I called his house and I couldn't get him on the phone. But his wife said the FBI had just shown up at their door 2 or 3 days before and told them not to talk to me. And I thought, wow, this is fascinating. How did they know? I was keeping this very close to the vest. And I said the FBI, and she said, well, the FBI or people like the FBI, and they warned us not to talk. So I was being monitored somehow, and they were very threatened by this story, but that story took a while to come out. The Nation, I wrote a piece about Bush and Parrott, very well documented, and they wouldn't run it. They were afraid of that story, and Navasky told me to avoid writing about the assassination. He said it was a quagmire. And I've realized eventually that the Nation, although they ran a couple of pieces that were pretty good on the assassination in '64, since then they've been covering it up, and supporting the Warren Commission version, so they're not as liberal or left-wing as they claim to be. And I write about that in Into the Nightmare. It's about 35 pages on Bush and my experiences trying to tell this story. And then, as I say, other authors, I think we have more free press in terms of writing books than we do in the mainstream media, because there's such pressures on the mainstream media from advertisers and the government, and the CIA has a lot of connections with the major newspapers, the Washington Post, the New York Times, etc. So to get them to tell the truth about these things is almost impossible. But books do come out, as you know, and some of them most are from smaller presses. The ones that come out from the big companies like Random House tend to support the Warren Report. But a lot of good books have come out with pieces of the story, and some not so good books. But it is part of free press in America that we can get the story out. And Russ Baker did a good book on the Bush family,
absolutely,
Family of Secrets, and he starts the book with me making that discovery in the library in San Bernardino, and he goes from there. And he found out something I didn't know, that in the memo where Bush called at 1:45 from Tyler, Texas, where he was giving a speech to tell them about Parrott, he said, I'm on my way to Dallas, and I'm going to be there at the Sheraton Hotel tonight, which was where the Secret Service and the government communications had their headquarters, actually. And but what Russ had found out was Bush was there on the night of the 21st. He gave a speech in Dallas, and I had not found that out. And so he was in Dallas the 21st, and then on the 22nd he goes to Tyler, and then he goes back to Dallas that night. Russ and I disagree. Russ thinks Bush went on to Houston. Barbara Bush, in her autobiography in '94, says they flew back to Love Field in Dallas and arrived as the Air Force Two was taking off, which is about 3:15 p.m. And then I think she said that they went to Houston. Russ believes they went on to Houston, but I think the evidence indicates they went to Dallas, and what Bush's role and all that is still somewhat unclear. But it's Russ found out more, and other people have found out more. So it opened a tremendous door, and so that's a pretty influential article I wrote back then.
Well, I would say so. It is the first chapter of Russ Baker's Family of Secrets, and it's influenced many a researcher's work. You absolutely hit the nail on the head there. It was just an important find. Now, there are a few questions I'd really like to ask you about as well, but we're going to have to wait till we do our next episode on Into the Nightmare for me to ask those, because I want to instead talk about your acting role in Orson Welles' The Other Side of the Wind. Now, I recently saw an article stating that The Other Side of the Wind is the best work that Netflix has ever debuted, which is very high praise. Now, this could be an entire show unto itself, of course, and I hate to shortchange this, but tell us a little bit about The Other Side of the Wind.
Well, first let me just say thank you for your nice comments on Into the Nightmare. It really means a lot coming from you and other researchers who approve of what I've done, and we all kind of stand on each other's shoulders and run with the leads. But anyway, on the Welles thing, I've had a very varied career, as you can tell. I've been a book writer and a newspaper man and a screenwriter for a while and teacher. And part of my Hollywood activity, I was doing my first book on Orson Welles when I was 19 years old, and took 4 years to do. It was called Orson Welles. It's a critical study, came out in '72 from British Film Institute. And there weren't too many books on Welles actually in English. That's why I wrote the book. And I was writing it, almost done with it at the time. And I came to Hollywood in 1970 for the first time. I was 23, and I was writing a book on John Ford, who's my favorite director, with Michael Wilmington. We were doing a critical study that was later published by the British Film Institute. And so I wanted to interview Ford, and I got an interview with him, which is extraordinary because he didn't like to give interviews. And it turned out to be, in that interview, he retired. He announced his retirement. It was quite momentous, and his career ended that day because he realized that, I write about this in my book, that his project that he was trying to do fell through, and I happened to be there. But while I was there, I called Peter Bogdanovich, who was a young, writer about film, and he had directed the film Targets, which I really liked. And he wasn't very well known, but I got his phone number and I called him, and I had kind of modeled my career to some extent on him interviewing old directors and going on sets of films. And so Peter kindly let me come to his house, and we were talking. He was about to go to Texas to do The Last Picture Show, which made him a big name director, but that was a little down the road. But he talked to me at length about Wells and Ford very helpfully. And but when I called him, he said, "I'm on the other line with Orson. Could you hold on?" I thought, "Oh my God!" I had been sending, while I was writing my book, publishing articles about Wells in magazines and in a book. I'd been sending those to Wells through his lawyer because I didn't know how else to get them to him. But I had no idea whether he got them or not, because he was always in Europe, I thought at the time. So I had no idea that he was around L.A. And so Peter got back to me and he said, "Orson would like you to call him tomorrow at such and such a number." So I called him, and I was stunned that he was in town, and it was just serendipity. But as Branch Rickey said, luck is the residue of design. I put myself in the right place at the right time, and I called the right people. And Wells said, he started by saying, "We're about to start shooting a film. Would you like to be in it?" Which kind of blew my mind, because I'd never really acted, and I was film critic, and this is Orson Welles, who was, made the film Citizen Kane that I thought was the film of films. And I said, I couldn't think of anything to say, so I just said, "Is this going to be a feature-length film?" I couldn't imagine he put me in a long film. So he laughed and said, "Well, we certainly hope so." And so he had me over to his house, and he described this project he was about to start shooting, and it became The Other Side of the Wind, which finally came out last fall from Netflix, and you can watch it on Netflix. And the story of the making of that is a long saga, 48 years of all kinds of turmoil, political, financial, legal turmoil, which is sort of what, it's kind of like what I went through with Frank Capra, but even a longer and more crazy saga. And Josh Karp wrote a good book about it, and I wrote a book called Whatever Happened to Orson Welles, A Portrait of an Independent Career. About a third of that is on The Other Side of the Wind. And so the story is a long one. There's also a documentary called They'll Love Me When I'm Dead, which deals with all the problems we encountered and why Welles made the film and how he came to make the film. And so I started shooting with him that Sunday. It was August 23rd, 1970. And I was playing a young, nerdy film critic, which I was. It was sort of a comical, slightly exaggerated version of myself. And I'm following around an elderly director played by John Huston. And the Huston character, Jake Hannaford, is a legendary old director who's trying to make a comeback in Hollywood, and he's meeting all the young people in the new Hollywood. This is what they call the Easy Rider era. We were in the middle of that. So Hollywood was undergoing this profound change, and he's desperately trying to finish a film and keep his career going. And it's sort of inspired by Ford, oddly enough, and other directors who were having trouble working in their old age in the new Hollywood. And so Wells let me write some of the dialogue with him. What he would do is he would say to me before a scene, what would you say to Jake, And then I'd throw out ideas for questions, try to make them sort of funny in a crazy film buff way, Is the camera a phallus, for example? He loved that line. So I got to say that in the film. And I asked him about what influence his father's suicide had on his film work. And he loved that too. But I was thinking, because Wells had explained to me the character was really based on Ernest Hemingway, who Wells knew and admired, but also he saw through his macho act. And Hemingway, of course, killed himself. And that was the spur for Wells to write this film, which he said was an attack on machoism, an exposure of a macho man, tyrannical director. Wells was very ambivalent about how we give too much power to movie directors, especially in that era. And so I asked about his father's suicide, and Wells eagerly thought, great. I didn't realize then that Wells thought his father had committed suicide, and he had driven him to it, is what he believed, by cutting him off when his father was an alcoholic, and Wells was persuaded not to see his father anymore in what we now call tough love, to try to get his father to stop drinking. His father drank himself to death in a hotel room, and Wells felt terribly guilty his whole life over that, and that's really the source of all his films are usually about one man betraying another man he loves, and that's where it comes from. So he put that into the film, and so I got to write my dialogue with him, but he would rewrite the lines and make them a little more pretentious or a little sillier or whatever, and then he would type it out, and then I had to say the lines exactly as written, and he wouldn't let me improvise any movements. He told me exactly, you turn left here, you take a few steps, you do this and this and this, and I was a complete tyro as an actor, and so I was putty in his hands, and I was willing to do whatever he wanted. And sometimes he'd get exasperated with me. He was very kind to actors. He loved actors. He thought actors were the most important people in a film. He was tough on the crew. He had young crew. They were mostly young guys who worked really hard, and he was a perfectionist. But he was a kind of bully toward me for about 3 years until, and I was, it made me kind of anxious. I didn't think I was pleasing him. But then 3 years into it, one of the crew said, we were watching The Rushes with Wells, and he said, I saw Joe up there, Joe really looks good up there on the screen, but then he always looks good on the screen. And I thought, wow, geez, he likes what I'm doing. So from that point on, I relaxed and had a good time for the next 3 years of shooting. And it was an amazing experience, as you can imagine. It's kind of a Walter Mitty experience for a young film buff to be in a film with all these legendary actors, and Wells directing this extremely personal testament film about the film business. And then I tried over time to help get the film out, which was a struggle. And then eventually other producers, Frank Marshall and Peter Bogdanovich and Philip Jan Rimza, got the film made and completed and supported by Netflix, which was a miracle in a sense, and it was brilliantly edited by Bob Murawski, who put together 96 hours of footage into a good simile of what Wells would have done, facsimile. Wells had edited 40 minutes of the film, but Bob cut the rest of it around it in that style that Wells had established, and it tells two stories at once. It's very complex. So I think they did a wonderful job, and I was an advisor on the final stage of production, post-production, with Jonathan Rosenbaum, who's another Wells critic, and we're listed as advisors in the credits. And so we got to critique a semi-final cut, and they took some of our suggestions and didn't take others. But anyway, it was a tremendous thing that the film finally came out, and I'm very pleased that it was well received, and people are debating all kinds of things about it. And I wrote a long article in Sight and Sound about it, and I'll be writing about Wells for the rest of my life. I joke that when I'm 90, I'll write a book called Orson Welles' The Last Word, which I'm sure I will, because one thing I found is when you start writing about somebody, it never ends, or some subject. Like I'll write more about the Kennedy assassination, and here I've written more about Capra. I didn't think I'd do another book on Capra, but here I have. And you have to keep researching and following developments in the stories that you track and write about, and then you people call upon you like you're doing to talk about them and discuss them, and that's part of the whole picture for a historian.
Joseph McBride, the author of Frankly, Unmasking Frank Capra. It's a new work published by Hightower Press. You can and should buy it on Amazon. But Joe, how can people follow you or your work online?
Well, yeah, thank you. I have a website, josephmcbridefilm.com, and I'm a little behind on it. I have to update it because I've been moving fast, but I have a lot of material on my books and my film work and photographs and articles, etc. on there. I also have websites on individual books, intothenightmare.com, which has a lot of interesting material and photographs and reviews and things like that, and interviews I've done, and thebrokenplaces.info on my memoir, and twocheersforhollywood.net, and howdidlubitsch.com on my most recent book. So those, I collect reviews and interviews and things and put them there. And, I love doing podcasts such as yours because it's a pleasure to talk to somebody who's read the book and knows what to ask about it and is interested in all the most interesting aspects of a work, So I think those are terrific, and I do a fair number of those, and I do audio commentaries, and so I try to keep a media presence and exchange with readers and interviewers, etc. And that's one great thing about the internet is that it circumvents the mainstream media. And I do interviews with major publications as well, but a lot of subjects such as the JFK assassination, the mainstream media are afraid of it, and it's the alternate media and the internet and podcasts that really do a good job covering such subjects. So I really appreciate that.
And thank you for all of your research as well. This has been Joseph McBride, a fantastic writer of nonfiction, and in my humble opinion, the best writer on the film industry that we have today. So whether you're fascinated by Frank Capra or Orson Welles or Steven Spielberg, or actually films in general, he also has some great compendiums too. Go look for his work, Joseph McBride. So Joe, we'll definitely have you back on soon to discuss Into the Nightmare, but congratulations on frankly unmasking Frank Capra. Thank you so much for being on.
Well, thank you so much, ST, and it's great being on your show, and I'd love to talk to you at length about the Kennedy assassination and the Tippit murder. There's such a endless, fertile topic, and there's so much we can discuss that it's of great interest, and you know so much about it, and your magazine, Garrison, really goes into tremendous depth. You have great people working for you and working with you, so I look forward to that.
Well, thank you so much, Joe. That's very kind. But before we go to the final thoughts, I want to leave everyone out there with one more trailer. This one for Mr. Smith Goes to Washington.
Now, far overshadowing every other triumph of filmdom's top director, three-time winner of the coveted Academy Award, comes Columbia's most important picture, the most timely, the most vital, the most significant picture any studio has ever produced.
Look at the Capitol Dome. It's all lighted up. Look at it.
You better relax, Senator. You'll get yourself plumb wore out.
What's that?
Movie houses.
To Don Quixote.
I can't help feeling that there's been a big mistake somehow.
A rare man these days.
Either he falls in line with us and behaves himself, or I'll break him so wide open that they'll never be able to find the pieces.
And there he found a nugget.
Is Moore, poet of Washington correspondence.
It's news when Frank Capra, master of human emotion, turns his camera on official Washington to capture all its deep human drama, to tell the amazing story of a small-town boy from nowhere who suddenly finds himself catapulted into the forefront of the day's news, playing a leading role in one of the nation's biggest dramas, finding romance and heartbreak in a picture that will make you laugh and cry, thrill you, touch you, get you by the throat.
So you want to be a senator, huh? You're going to build a camp on Willow Creek. See this? Deficiency bill. Section number 40. A dam going up where you think your camp's going to be. That's why they sent you here in the first place, because you don't know a dam from a bathtub.
All right, sir, I guess I'll just have to speak to the people of my state from right here. And I'll tell you one thing, that wild horses aren't going to drag me off this floor until those people have heard everything I've got to say, even if it takes all winter.
Filibuster! A filibuster! This is the miracle I wanted. What a yarn!
Farrell, just get everything he's saying back to that home state, will you?
This is Columbia's H.V. Kaltenborn again, back on the Senate firing line where history is in the making. Senator Smith has now talked for 23 hours and 16 minutes. But those tired boy ranger legs are buckling, bleary-eyed, voice gone. He can't go on much longer, and all official Washington is here to be in on the kill.
Stop, Jeff, stop!
As much as it bothers me to have to answer questions for the third time regarding my part-time job writing for the American Free Press, I'm going to do so again here quickly. And what I'll say, I've said before on the show, so some of you have heard it now 3 times, but I said I would do this, and so I will. As you know, because I say it all the time, I consider myself a nonpartisan. My favorite Twitter hashtag is hashtag 2 sides, same coin. I voted third party since 1996 and will again in 2020. I like writing for the AFP. I like the editors I work with directly. I've never met 90% of the staff, as we all work from our homes across America. There's no central office where we congregate and discuss a strategy of some kind. It's just not happening. I never met or knew Willis Carto, Michael Collins Piper, Victor Thorne, and most of the other AFP writers who even write for it now. I know very few people associated, and the one I know best is Don Jeffries. So Willis Carto was Mark Lane's best friend and vice versa. I've been told that many times. But I never knew him personally, so the three that I named, Willis Carto, Michael Collins Piper, Victor Thorne, they'd all passed on years before I began. Now, the AFP today is a populist conservative paper. They do not like George Bush. They do not like John McCain. They do not like Mitt Romney. It's more of a Ron Paul, Rand Paul kind of thing now. But Don Jeffries and I were hired because we're both about as middle of the road as you can get. We truly have zero stake in any political party. We're both almost equally disgusted, actually, by the two-party monopoly, to tell you the truth. And so the Spotlight, which closed down years ago, it later became the AFP, and some writers, including Willis Carto, have been labeled by some as anti-Semitic or Holocaust deniers and a whole lot of other things. And again, I know very few people associated with the AFP, and I don't think I know one person who was associated with the Spotlight full-time. I really don't. I'm not anti-Semitic. I know Don Jeffries is not anti-Semitic. I'm not a Holocaust denier, neither is he. I'm not someone who criticizes the established, accepted history of the Holocaust. I haven't done that once. And frankly, I don't even know enough about the topic to say much of anything on the Holocaust. See, all history teachers have their sort of areas of specialty, and many are fixated on World War II. I was never one of them. I was much more interested in 18th century America or late 20th century America. I would never put my stamp of approval on Holocaust denial in general, and I'm really not a fan of it at all. So you'll never hear a Holocaust episode of this show, and I don't believe I've ever written an article that deals with either Israel or the Holocaust as a main topic, and the editors at the AFP have never, not once have they ever told me what position to take on a story. Not once. I do what I do, and then I hand them in. Then my articles get printed, and that's it. In recent months, I've criticized Trump, I've written an article in support of Tulsi Gabbard, and I've been very supportive of Bernie Sanders against the DNC and the primary process. For those who are listening to this a third time, I'm sorry you had to do so. I will continue doing what I believe is good work for the AFP, and I hope you all like it too. So for those who have met me in person at a conference or elsewhere, I hope that that experience also speaks for itself. I do not like hate, I do not preach hate, and I do not accept hate as an alternative. Ever. So, until the next time, my friends, from the other side of the mountain, on the best side of midnight, I wish you peace.